When the first alerts came in, they sounded almost routine. Sirens over Israeli cities, reports of incoming missiles, the familiar language of intercepts and defense systems activated. But within hours, something very different appeared on the global radar. This time, it wasn't just Iran launching missiles toward Israel. This time, the United States answered with direct, large-scale strikes on Iranian cities themselves. And suddenly, the question shifted from what happened last night to something far more unsettling. Are we watching the Middle East cross a line that it may not be able to come back from? Let's slow down and unpack what is really going on here. Because on the surface, it looks like just another round of escalation in a region used to crises. Yet underneath, this confrontation touches the core of American power, Iranian strategy, Israel's security doctrine, and the fragile architecture of global stability. In other words, this is not just about missiles and airstrikes. It's about what kind of world emerges on the other side of this confrontation. So, what actually triggered this moment? In recent weeks, tensions between Iran and Israel had been building to a breaking point. Iranian leaders had signaled that further attacks on their soil and assets would be met with direct retaliation, not through proxies, but from Iran itself. Israel, already under intense pressure from ongoing conflict and security threats, was on high alert. When Iran eventually launched waves of missiles and drones aimed at Israel, and at military facilities across the region housing American forces, it wasn't a surprise in strategic terms, but it was a shock in scale and symbolism. Iran wanted to send a clear message. It was willing to strike across borders, at range, and at multiple targets simultaneously, even at the risk of provoking a larger war. Israel's response followed its long-standing doctrine of deterrence and overwhelming retaliation. But what really changed the equation was Washington's decision to move beyond the shadows of covert operations, beyond limited strikes on Iranian-backed groups in third countries, and openly hit targets inside Iran's own territory. These were not just isolated military facilities in the desert. Explosions were reported in and around major cities, including strategic sites near Tehran and other population centers. The signal from the United States was as blunt as it gets. If Iran is going to attack Israel and U.S. assets directly, then Iran itself is no longer a sanctuary. Now, here's the important question. Why did Washington choose this path, knowing full well that striking inside another large regional power is an escalatory step? Part of the answer lies in credibility. For years, the U.S. posture in the Middle East has been criticized as reactive, cautious, and sometimes indecisive. Repeated attacks by Iran and its allied militias on U.S. bases, ships, and partners had been met with limited, targeted responses designed to restore deterrence without triggering a full-scale war. But if Iran is launching large missile barrages on Israel and on bases hosting U.S. troops, that formula stops working. At some point, Washington felt that failing to respond forcefully would invite more attacks, not fewer, and send a dangerous signal to other rivals watching closely, from Moscow to Beijing. There's another layer too, domestic politics. In the United States, even when there is fatigue with foreign wars, there is also intense pressure on any administration not to appear weak when American troops and allies come under fire. That domestic pressure often pushes leaders toward visible, decisive action. When you combine that with Israel's own expectations of American backing in its most dangerous hour, the incentive to respond aggressively becomes almost irresistible. The result? U.S. air and missile strikes aimed at degrading Iran's command structure, its missile sites, and key military infrastructure, even at the risk of collateral political and strategic damage. But if Washington is making a statement, so is Tehran. Iran's leadership understands that it cannot match the United States or Israel, plane for plane or missile for missile, in a symmetric war. Instead, Iran has spent decades investing in a different type of power: long-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, and a sprawling network of aligned militias and non-state actors across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and beyond. When Iran launched its missiles and drones in retaliation, it wasn't just about inflicting casualties. It was about demonstrating that it can threaten Israel's population centers, disrupt U.S. military basing, and destabilize the broader regional environment whenever it chooses. This is central to Iran's strategy. It knows that it cannot occupy foreign territory or fight classic large-scale conventional wars like a superpower. What it can do is raise the cost of any attack against it by making sure that the conflict spills over into multiple countries, involves multiple fronts, and touches global economic arteries, from energy exports to maritime choke points. Iran's message is simple. If you come for us directly, it will not be a contained conflict. Everyone will feel it. And that is exactly what the region is now confronting. The U.S.-Israeli operation against Iran has already reverberated across the Middle East, pulling in Arab states that host American forces or sit under the regional missile envelope, whether they like it or not. Airports, shipping lanes, and energy infrastructure are all suddenly at higher risk. Governments that wanted nothing more than stability and investment are now recalculating their exposure. How do you reassure investors when missile flight paths pass uncomfortably close to your financial centers and your oil terminals? At the same time, this clash is exposing the limits of modern missile defense. We often hear impressive statistics about interception rates and layered defense systems, from Patriot batteries to Arrow and other advanced systems. But no missile defense is perfect. Iran's use of large salvos, mixed with drones and different trajectories, aims to saturate these defenses, forcing them to decide which targets to prioritize in a matter of seconds. Even if a high percentage of incoming projectiles is intercepted, the few that leak through can cause real damage, both physical and psychological. When even one missile lands near a major urban area or a critical base, it undercuts the narrative of invulnerability and raises fear among civilians and soldiers alike. This is important because deterrence is not just about hardware, it's about perception. If populations in Israel, the Gulf, or even American personnel on bases begin to feel that they are permanently under the shadow of possible strikes, the political cost of continuing confrontation rises. Leaders lose room to maneuver, calls for retaliation increase, and de-escalation becomes harder to sell at home. Now let's consider how other major powers are reading this crisis. Russia and China have long watched U.S. entanglements in the Middle East with a mixture of concern and opportunity. On one hand, they want to prevent a total regional meltdown that would disrupt energy flows and global markets, especially at a time when the world economy is fragile. On the other hand, every time Washington is dragged into a high-stakes confrontation in the Middle East, its attention and resources are diverted away from Europe and Asia. That strategic distraction is useful for Moscow in the context of its own clashes with the West, and for Beijing as it seeks to expand its influence in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Russia in particular has cultivated close ties with Iran, militarily and politically. It has relied on Iranian drones and cooperation in regional theaters. Moscow understands a great deal about Iran's military capacity, especially its missile arsenal and production lines, in a way that Washington and its allies may not fully grasp. This gives Russia a unique vantage point on how far Iran can push and how long it can sustain a high-intensity exchange. Yet Russia also has an interest in avoiding a direct all-out war that could destroy Iran's core infrastructure. A weakened, isolated Iran is a partner Moscow can leverage. A collapsed Iran is a strategic vacuum that others could fill. China, meanwhile, has invested heavily in economic relationships with Gulf states and increasingly with Iran itself. Beijing's core priority is stability in the flows of energy and trade, not ideological alignment in regional disputes. It wants to be seen as a rising diplomatic broker, capable of hosting talks and mediating between longtime rivals. But it also has no desire to be drawn directly into the middle of a shooting war between the US, Israel, and Iran. So China faces a dilemma: how to protect its interests and burnish its image as a responsible global actor, while avoiding any commitment that could put it at odds with either side. All of this means that while the missiles may be flying over the Middle East, the political shockwaves are radiating as far as Moscow and Beijing. Both of these capitals will use this crisis to underscore their narrative that U.S. security guarantees are unstable, that Washington is prone to escalation, and that alternative security and economic arrangements, whether through Eurasian platforms, energy deals, or parallel financial systems, are necessary to hedge against American unpredictability. But let's bring this back to the ground level. Strikes on Iranian cities, even when aimed at military facilities, carry enormous risks. Urban areas are dense. Military industrial sites can sit close to civilian neighborhoods, infrastructure, and commercial hubs. Even when precision-guided munitions are used, the potential for miscalculation or unintended damage remains. Every civilian casualty, every hit on a power plant or a hospital nearby, deepens anger and fuels narratives of injustice. In Iran, this reinforces the leadership's framing of the conflict as a struggle for national dignity and survival against foreign aggression. In neighboring societies, it intensifies fears that they could be next if the conflict widens. At the same time, missile attacks on Israel and on bases hosting U.S. troops are not just symbolic gestures. They risk causing casualties among soldiers and civilians from multiple nations. Each funeral, each image of destroyed infrastructure or damaged runways becomes another piece of emotional ammunition for hardliners on all sides who argue that negotiations are pointless and only force will secure their interests. This is how escalation spirals. Both sides believe they are responding, not initiating. Both frame their actions as defensive, as measures to restore deterrence. Yet each response changes the baseline and pushes the threshold of what is considered acceptable. In the current clash, the crossing of the line into direct U.S. strikes on Iranian soil and direct Iranian barrages on Israeli cities and U.S. bases has moved the region into a far more dangerous phase of confrontation than many policymakers may have originally intended. Where does this leave the regional powers that find themselves in the middle, physically and politically? Arab Gulf states, for example, have spent the past decade trying to diversify their economies, attract foreign investment, and project an image of stability and modernity. They host U.S. forces, rely on American security guarantees, but many of them also maintain channels of communication with Iran. They understand that geographically, they will always live in Iran's neighborhood. Even if they disagree deeply with Iranian policies, they cannot simply wish Tehran away. These states now face extremely difficult choices. On one hand, they depend on American defense systems and security ties to deter threats from Iran and other actors. On the other, if they are perceived as active participants in a U.S.-Israeli campaign against Iran, they risk becoming targets for Iranian missiles and drones. Investors watch this very carefully. Capital does not like uncertainty, especially when that uncertainty involves air raid sirens and insurance premiums on critical infrastructure. If this crisis drags on, we are likely to see increased pressure on these states to distance themselves publicly from the front lines of the conflict, even as they quietly rely on U.S. protection behind the scenes. Meanwhile, European allies of the United States are grappling with their own dilemmas. Many European governments have long advocated for diplomatic engagement with Iran, including nuclear agreements, in an effort to prevent exactly this sort of confrontation. But they also stand formally aligned with the United States and are deeply connected to Israel through security, economic, and political ties. A major escalation involving direct U.S. strikes on Iranian cities forces these governments to calibrate their responses carefully. They may offer rhetorical support for Israel's right to defend itself and for American personnel under threat, but at the same time they worry about refugee flows, energy disruptions, and the broader erosion of international norms around sovereignty and use of force. At the level of global norms, this conflict raises a painful question. What happens when the world's leading power openly attacks the territory of a regional adversary that also has significant conventional and asymmetric capabilities? Some will argue that Washington is defending a partner under attack and deterring further aggression. Others will argue that the precedent of striking cities in a large non-nuclear state will embolden future attacks by others, or encourage targeted states to seek more dangerous deterrence, including nuclear capabilities, to avoid being in this vulnerable position again. And that leads us to the nuclear question. Not in the sense of an imminent nuclear exchange, but in terms of strategic calculations. Iran is not officially recognized as a nuclear-armed state, but it has advanced its nuclear program, maintained leverage through enrichment, and used that as a bargaining chip in its dealings with the West. When Iranian cities come under attack from high-precision weapons, the incentive to develop help a more robust deterrent grow stronger. It tells the leadership in Tehran, and potentially in other capitals around the world, that without the ultimate deterrent, their infrastructure, their leadership, and their population can be targeted in a high-intensity conflict. That is not a direction that favors global non-proliferation efforts. On the other side, Israeli and American strategists are calculating how far they can degrade Iran's capabilities without crossing thresholds that trigger uncontrollable escalation. They want to weaken Iran's ability to threaten Israel and U.S. bases, possibly to decapitate key parts of its military leadership or its command and control structures. But they also know that pushing too far could prompt Iran to unleash everything it has at once: missiles, drones, cyber attacks, and regional proxies, in a final effort to impose costs on those attacking it. In a tightly linked global economy, that kind of shock could be devastating not just for the region, but for markets worldwide. There is another dimension to this crisis that is less visible than missiles, but just as important: information and narrative. Every side in this conflict is fighting for control over how events are perceived, both at home and abroad. Governments highlight the accuracy of their strikes, the legality of their actions, and the care they take to avoid civilians, while emphasizing the recklessness and brutality of their opponents. Social media amplifies images and claims, often before they can be verified, shaping public emotion in real time. In Iran, scenes of destruction caused by foreign strikes feed a sense of collective outrage and resistance. In Israel and among its partners, images of missile craters and damaged sites reinforce the need for strong defense and decisive action. In the United States, images of wounded soldiers or damaged bases can crystallize calls for punishment and resolve. And in this battlefield of narratives, the line between genuine analysis and propaganda becomes blurred. That's where careful, calm geopolitical analysis is essential, asking not just who hit whom, but what each move is designed to achieve, what risks it carries, and what exit ramps, if any, remain. So, what are the possible paths forward? One scenario is a prolonged, low to medium intensity conflict, with periodic bursts of severe escalation. The United States and Israel continue to hit Iranian targets, especially those tied to missile production, command centers, and strategic infrastructure. Iran responds with carefully calibrated missile and drone strikes against Israeli and U.S.-linked assets, while trying to avoid crossing some red lines that could justify an even more devastating response from Washington or trigger broader international intervention. In this scenario, the region lives under a constant shadow of potential escalation, with diplomacy struggling to keep up. Another scenario is the search for a diplomatic off-ramp, likely mediated by third parties such as European states, Gulf countries, or even China. This would not be a traditional peace deal, but rather a series of tacit understandings, limits on the types of targets struck, pauses in attacks to allow back-channel talks, and perhaps some form of renewed negotiation over Iran's missile and nuclear programs, coupled with security understandings regarding Israel and U.S. forces in the region. The challenge is that such diplomacy requires trust, or at least a minimal level of confidence that commitments will be respected. At the moment, that trust is extremely thin. A darker scenario is that of miscalculation, a strike that kills high-ranking leaders in a way that Iran feels it simply cannot leave unanswered, or a missile that accidentally causes mass casualties in a busy city center in Israel or a neighboring state. Such an event could trigger a chain reaction that overwhelms the careful calibration both sides have tried to maintain. Domestic pressure in Tehran, Jerusalem, or Washington could then push leaders into escalation they might have preferred to avoid. When missiles are flying and communication is tense, the space for miscalculation is dangerously wide. Amid all these scenarios, one uncomfortable reality stands out. The current model of security in the Middle East, based on deterrence through superior firepower and a network of alliances, is under immense strain. The idea that one or two countries can guarantee lasting stability through military dominance alone looks increasingly fragile when non-state actors, drone swarms, and highly capable missile arsenals can bypass traditional power balances. The U.S. strikes on Iranian cities may deliver tactical successes, destroying key sites, degrading some capabilities, but they do not, on their own, resolve the underlying drivers of conflict: contested regional influence, unresolved grievances, and the absence of inclusive security frameworks. So where does that leave us? And what does it mean for the future of international diplomacy and global stability? It means that diplomacy can no longer be treated as an optional extra that you return to once the real work of war is done. In an era where regional conflicts have global reverberations, where missile ranges cross borders and markets react instantly, diplomacy has to move closer to the center of strategy, not sit on the margins. It means that regional security can't be built solely on the assumption that one side will always be able to dominate the other without consequence. The strike on Iranian cities and Iran's missile attacks on Israel show that both sides now have the capacity to hurt each other and to drag others into the fallout. It also means that the international system needs to think seriously about crisis management in a world where mid-level powers have high-impact tools. The traditional model, where only a handful of superpowers could project this level of force, no longer holds. That raises tough questions for institutions like the United Nations, for coalitions of regional states, and for informal groupings of major powers. Who steps in when two adversaries cross a threshold that threatens wider stability? Who has enough credibility and leverage with both Washington and Tehran, or with Israel and Iran, to broker pauses and shape frameworks? And perhaps most critically, it means that global stability can't be separated from regional justice and perception. As long as millions of people across the region feel that their security is negotiable, their sovereignty fragile, and their voices sidelined, the ground will remain fertile for confrontation. Strikes may temporarily silence missiles, but they do not silence anger or fear. So as we look at this moment, U.S. missiles hitting Iranian cities, Iranian missiles targeting Israel and U.S. assets, allies and rivals watching closely, the question we should be asking is not only who wins this round, but what kind of international order are we building in the process? Are we moving toward a world where more states feel compelled to seek extreme deterrence to avoid what Iran is now experiencing? Or will this crisis become the shock that pushes regional and global powers to rethink how they manage security, influence, and rivalry in the 21st century? Those answers are not written yet. They will depend on decisions made in the coming days and weeks. Decisions about restraint, about dialogue, about when to stop and when to talk. The missiles may dominate the headlines today, but history will remember whether this moment marked another step toward a more fragmented, unstable world, or whether it became a turning point that forced leaders to rediscover the difficult, imperfect, but ultimately essential craft of diplomacy. In the end, the real measure of power is not just how many targets a country can destroy in another's cities, but how effectively it can help build an order where those cities no longer have to fear the next siren. And right now, in the shadow of these strikes, that is the test facing not just Washington and Tehran, or Israel and its neighbors, but the entire international community.